Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. I'm glad you're here. Most of the men who end up on this channel came to the Philippines chasing something. A woman they'd been talking to online for 6 months. A retirement dream they'd seen in a YouTube video. A business idea that made sense on paper. A second chance at something they felt they'd missed. The man whose story you're about to hear came chasing none of that. His name is Brendan. He's 52 years old, from County Leitrim in the west of Ireland. He spent the better part of his working life underground, first in the Arigna coal mines in Roscommon, then in the collieries of Fife in Scotland, until his knees decided they'd had enough of that. He's not a man who talks much. He'll tell you that himself. And when he does talk, he says what he means and leaves it there. Brendan arrived in the Philippines with no plan, no romantic prospect, no investment scheme. He'd read the warnings. He knew about the scams. He was, by any reasonable measure, a careful man with his eyes open. He's been here 3 years now, and what happened to him in those 3 years is not the story you're expecting. There's no villain in this one. No fake profile, no construction project on land he didn't own, no woman with 3 other foreign boyfriends in rotation. The thing that happened to Brendan was quieter than all of that, and in some ways harder to explain. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll start with Myriad, because you can't start anywhere else. We were married 26 years, met when I was 24, at a dance in Carrick-on-Shannon, which tells you what era we're talking about, the kind of dance where there was a cloakroom, and a man on the door checking you weren't too drunk to be let in. She was from Roscommon originally. We had 2 kids, a house, the whole thing. It wasn't a dramatic life. It wasn't supposed to be. She died on a Tuesday afternoon. Heart attack, 49 years old. She was hanging washing on the line in the back garden, and I found her when I came home from my mate Packy's house at 3:30. The hospital said it was quick. I don't know if that's true or if it's just what they say. I'm not going to say much more about that. Some things you don't need to perform for people. I stayed in the house for 2 years after. My daughter Awefa thought I should sell it. My son Ciaran was in Melbourne and called on Sundays and didn't know what to say, which wasn't his fault because nobody knew what to say. My mates from the pit days, the ones still in Ireland, the ones I'd kept up with, they'd meet me for a pint, and we'd talk about football and the price of things, and by the second round, we'd all run out of road. I don't blame them for that either. What do you say to a man like that? I wasn't in a bad way, exactly. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't drinking too hard. I wasn't thinking about anything drastic. I wasn't there. Do you know what I mean? Present in the body. Gone everywhere else. I'd sit in the kitchen in the morning with a mug of tea and look at her teacup, still on the shelf where she'd left it. And an hour would go by, and I wouldn't have moved. I sold the house eventually because staying in it was doing something to me I couldn't name. Walked away with $158,000 after the mortgage cleared. Added that to what I had from the miners' pension scheme and the state pension, which between the 2 of them comes to something you could live modestly on in Ireland if you were careful, and comfortably in other places, as it turned out. Put the money in the credit union and didn't touch it and didn't much look at it. That was me, 52 years old, retired. Both kids scattered. A flat amount of money and nothing particular to do with any of it. The Philippines came from a Facebook group. I don't even remember how I found it. One of those things where the algorithm decides you need to see something, and eventually you do. It was mostly British fellas, few Irish, talking about cost of living and weather, and places I'd never heard of. Dumaguete, Cebu, Siargao. I read it for 6 months without posting once. Never said a word. Just read. I want to be honest about what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for a woman. I know that's what most of these stories are about, and I understand why people assume it. But that wasn't it. I just wanted somewhere that wasn't Carrick-on-Shannon in November. Somewhere the darkness didn't start at 4 in the afternoon. Somewhere I could be a stranger, which sounds like a strange thing to want. But when you've lived your whole life in a small town and everyone in it knows your grief and reflects it back at you every time they look at you, being a stranger sounded like the most restful thing in the world. One February night, I booked a one-way ticket to Cebu. I didn't research it particularly. The flight was there, the price was manageable, and I pressed the button before I could talk myself out of it. Told a waif the next morning. She was worried. I told her I'd be fine. Neither of us knew if that was true. Cebu City nearly finished me before I started. I came out of Mactan Airport into the heat and the noise and the traffic, and I genuinely thought I'd made a catastrophic error. It was like someone had taken everything, every sound, every smell, every vehicle, every person with somewhere urgent to be, and compressed it into a space about a quarter of the size it needed. The humidity sat on you like a wet coat you couldn't take off. I'd been underground in temperatures that would frighten most people, and I'd never felt anything quite like that heat. I was at my guest house on the first evening, in a common room that smelled of instant coffee and someone else's dinner, when I met Alan. Scottish fella, from Dundee, retired, 4 years in the Philippines. He heard me complaining and didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated, and he said, "You're in the wrong place." He told me about Dumaguete. Quieter, he said. More manageable. A university town on Negros Oriental, down in the Visayas. Lots of expats, but not the circus kind. He said it slowly, the way you describe somewhere you genuinely like. I took the ferry 2 days later without much conviction either way. And Dumaguete, I don't know how to explain it except to say it was sized for a human being. There's a boulevard along the sea, old acacia trees along it, benches facing the water, tricycles puttering past, the noise at a register where you could still hear yourself think. I walked the boulevard that first evening and sat on a bench and looked at the Tannin Strait and the mountains of Cebu across the water going purple in the last of the light. And I felt not happy. I'm not saying happy, but present. Actually there. In my body, in the world, in that specific moment on that specific bench. That was something. After 2 years of not feeling that was genuinely something. I found an apartment near the boulevard within the week. 18,000 pesos a month, about €300. I sat in it the first night and did the sums on a piece of paper, and could not quite believe them. A full meal at the Carinderia around the corner cost 150 pesos. A tricycle anywhere in town, 20 pesos. My pension and the miner's top-up, which in Ireland left me careful and a bit short most months, here made me comfortable in a way I hadn't been in years. I wasn't happy, but I was present. And for the time being, present was enough. I want to be honest about those first weeks, because I think people who talk about moving to a place like this tend to make it sound more romantic than it was. I walked the boulevard every evening. That's what I did. I'd finish whatever I'd eaten for dinner, usually something from the Carinderia 2 streets back from my apartment, 150 pesos for rice and whatever was in the pot, that day adobo or sinigang, or sometimes just fried fish. And then I'd walk the boulevard and sit on one of the benches facing the Tannin Strait and watch the water go dark. There's a moment in the evening there, maybe 6 o'clock, when the light goes a particular color across the water, and the mountains of Cebu on the other side go purple and gray. I sat and watched that happen a lot of evenings in those first weeks. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't healing. I was just sitting. But sitting there felt different to sitting in the kitchen in Carrick-on-Shannon, which is something. The apartment I found was on a small street about 10 minutes' walk from the boulevard. Third floor of a building that also had a sari-sari store on the ground level, and a family I never really met on the second. 18,000 pesos a month. The first time I converted that properly, sat down with my phone and checked the rate 3 times because I thought I was making an error. It came to just under €300. I'd been paying $900 a month for a 1-bedroom flat in Carrick after I sold the house. $300. For a 2-room apartment with a balcony where I could see a strip of sea between the buildings if I leaned out at the right angle. I did the sums the way I used to figure out a new piece of equipment underground. Methodically. Wrote it on the back of an envelope. Rent, $300. Food. I was spending maybe €70–80 a month eating at the Carinderia, and occasionally treating myself to a proper sit-down meal somewhere near the university. Tricycle fares for getting around, almost nothing, 20 pesos a ride, which is less than 40 cents. My state pension and the miner's top-up together come to about €1,400 a month. In Ireland, that was tight. In Dumaguete, that was, I don't know. Comfortable is the wrong word because I wasn't comfortable exactly, not emotionally, but financially I had more than I needed for the first time in my adult life. That took some getting used to. The first month I barely spoke to anyone. That suited me fine. Alan came down from Cebu in late March. He had a mate in Dumaguete he visited a few times a year, and it was Alan who told me about the Tuesday morning coffee group. There's a cafe near Silliman University, one of those places with mismatched furniture and a cabinet full of pastries and a ceiling fan that works about 60% of the time. And on Tuesday mornings, a group of foreign men gathered there at 9 o'clock and sat for an hour or two and talked about whatever needed talking about. I went once because Alan asked me to, and I didn't have a reason to say no. There were 8 or 9 of them that first Tuesday. Mostly British. A couple from the Midlands, one from Yorkshire, one quiet fella from somewhere in Scotland who barely said more than I did. 2 Americans, both retired military as far as I could tell, and one other Irish lad, a man named Jerry from Waterford, who'd been in Dumaguete for 3 years and had the slightly dazed look of someone who'd stopped counting how long he'd been away from home. I sat and drank a coffee that was too strong and too sweet, and said almost nothing for the full hour. Nobody pushed me to talk, which I appreciated. At the end, Alan clapped me on the shoulder and said something like, "Same time next week," and I nodded, and I went back the following Tuesday. I don't entirely know why. I think by that point I'd been alone with my own head for long enough that, even sitting in a room where other people were talking, without having to participate much, felt like something. Company at a remove, which was about all I could manage. The thing I noticed in those early Tuesday mornings, before I really understood what I was seeing, was how differently the men carried themselves. There were ones who leaned forward when they talked, animated, with things to report. A trip they'd taken to Siargao, a problem they'd sorted with their visa extension at the Bureau of Immigration, something funny their partner's nephew had done. And there were ones who sat back and waited for the conversation to come to them. And when it did, they delivered the same material they'd delivered the week before, with the same pauses, in the same places. And I thought, there's something in that difference. I just didn't have a name for it yet. The silence in Dumaguete evenings is different to the silence in Leitrim. In Leitrim, the silence is just absence of sound. Here it's always got things in it. A tricycle somewhere in the distance. someone's cockerel at 3:30 in the morning, karaoke from a house 2 streets over that somehow sounds less irritating than you'd expect it to once you get used to it. The church bells from the cathedral, at times I couldn't predict, and eventually stopped trying to. At night, from my balcony, I could sometimes hear the family somewhere below playing music. Filipino pop, mostly, which I couldn't have named a single song of, but which had a quality of cheerfulness to it that I found, I don't know, bearable. More than bearable some evenings. I wasn't fixed. I want to be clear about that. Meriad was still gone. That hadn't changed, and wasn't going to. But there was a difference, after about 6 weeks in Dumaguete, between the silence inside me and the silence around me. Before, they'd been the same silence. Now they were separate things. That sounds like a small distinction. It didn't feel small. I was still attending the Tuesday coffees when Alan headed back to Cebu. By then, I'd started talking a bit more. Not much, but a bit. And it was at one of those Tuesdays, about 8 weeks in, that I properly met Dennis for the first time. Though he'd been there before and I hadn't registered him particularly. He was a big man, Dennis, gone a bit soft around the middle the way men do when they stop having a reason to stay in shape. With a West Midlands accent you could have cut glass with, and the kind of unhurried patience I associated with men who'd spent decades in front of classrooms. He taught secondary school in Wolverhampton for 30-odd years. History and geography, he told me later. You could tell. He had a way of explaining things. The Philippines, the people, the way things worked here. That was orderly and thorough without being condescending. The way a good teacher talks about something they've spent a long time understanding properly. He asked me, on that second or third Tuesday, when I'd started talking a little, how I was finding it. Not how I was finding the coffee or the weather or the cost of living. How I was finding it. I said something like, grand, getting there. He nodded as if that was the most complete answer I could have given, and didn't press further. I think I liked him from that moment, though I'd have found it difficult to say so at the time. By about the 3rd month, I'd started to understand what kind of place Dumaguete actually was. Not the postcard version, the real one. The Facebook group back in Ireland had given me the impression that expat life here was fairly straightforward. Retired men, low cost of living, pleasant weather. And it is those things. But what nobody mentioned, or what I hadn't read closely enough, was the social ecosystem that comes with it. The community of foreign men in Dumaguete is not a community in the way a village in Leitrim is a community. It's more like a waiting room. People arrive, people leave, people stay longer than they planned, and in the meantime, everyone sits together and talks. I got good at watching. Always was. Underground. You learn to read small things. The sound of a support shifting, a change in air pressure, the way another man holds himself when something's not right. I applied the same attention to the Tuesday morning coffees and the Friday evenings at a bar near the boulevard, where a few of the group would gather over San Miguel and whatever football was on the screen in the corner. And what I saw over those first few months was that the foreign men in Dumaguete sorted themselves fairly naturally into 3 kinds. The first kind were the burned ones. Men who'd come here, or to Thailand first, or Vietnam, and had their money taken, their trust gutted, their confidence in their own judgment shaken loose. They hadn't left. That was the interesting thing. They stayed, but they'd calcified around the experience. They had Facebook group chats, where they posted screenshots of profiles they'd identified as fake. They had theories and taxonomies and warning systems. They talked about their losses the way old soldiers talk about campaigns, with the specificity of men who've committed the details to permanent memory. I respected them. I did. They weren't wrong about what they'd experienced. But an hour in their company left me feeling slightly bleak, and I noticed I started arriving at Friday evenings slightly later to avoid the long version of certain stories I'd heard twice already. The second kind were the ones who'd made something work. Men with Filipina partners, some for years, some for over a decade, who'd integrated themselves more or less into local life. They talked about their partners' families by name. They complained about the same things, but differently, the way you complain about something you're also committed to. They'd learned enough Cebuano to be useful. They had routines, relationships, a sense of being somewhere rather than just passing through. I watched these men carefully. Not enviously exactly, but carefully. And then there was the third kind. And this is the one I want you to pay attention to, because I think this is the kind that nobody warns you about properly. These were the men who had simply stopped. They'd arrived, some of them years ago, some of them meaning to stay for 6 months, and they were still here, and nothing much had developed in the interval. They weren't in bad relationships. They weren't being scammed. They weren't unhappy in any obvious way. They'd put themselves down somewhere and hadn't picked themselves back up. By noon, they were usually watching something on a laptop. They drank at a pace that was slightly too consistent across the day. They told the same 3 stories in the same order, with the same pauses in the same places. And you could tell they'd told them so many times they no longer really heard themselves telling them. They weren't bad men. That's the thing. Some of them were quite good company, in small doses. They'd just ceased somehow, stopped being anyone in particular. And Dumaguete, to its credit or its fault, depending on how you look at it, will not push you. It will simply accommodate whatever version of yourself you bring to it, indefinitely and without complaint. I was frightened of becoming that. More frightened of it than of being scammed or cheated or made a fool of. A scam is something that happens to you. Stopping is something you do to yourself. Dennis noticed that about me, I think, though we never discussed it directly. Dennis was not a man who discussed things directly if he could help it. 30 years in a classroom teaches you to read people sideways, to come at the difficult thing from an angle. He invited me for a beer one Friday evening, just the 2 of us, at a place called a restaurant, but which was really just a family's front room with a few plastic tables and a fridge full of Red Horse. He ordered for both of us without asking, which I didn't mind. We talked about Wolverhampton for a while, about coal mining, which he knew nothing about, and asked sensible questions, about how long I was planning to stay, which I said I didn't know, which was honest. His partner Rowena came to collect him at the end of the evening. She'd been at her sister's, and she shook my hand and said it was nice to finally meet me, Poe. And I didn't know what Poe meant yet, and nodded and probably looked confused. Dennis explained it later. A term of respect, added to sentences as a marker of politeness. He explained it the way he'd explain something to a student, clearly without condescension, checking I'd followed. I started spending time with the 2 of them together after that. Sunday lunches sometimes, at a Mang Inasal near the Robinsons Mall where Rowena liked the chicken. She said they did it better than anywhere else in Dumaguete, and argued this point with the certainty of someone who had done extensive research. Weekend afternoons at their apartment, which was larger than mine and considerably better furnished, and had a small balcony garden that Rowena maintained with a focus I found impressive. Through them, slowly, I got my first real sense of what Filipino family life actually was. Not from a warning video, not from a Facebook post, from sitting in rooms with these people and watching how they moved through the world. Rowena had 3 siblings. Her mother was in a town called Bayawan, about an hour south on the provincial bus. She had cousins in Cebu City, a nephew in Cagayan de Oro, an aunt in a barangay outside Dumaguete, whose name I could never quite catch. She was connected, is the only way I can put it. Connected to all of them, simultaneously, by a web of obligation and affection that I couldn't fully map and that never seemed to switch off. Her phone went at odd hours. She sent money via GCash regularly, not dramatically, just as a fact of life, the way you'd pay a bill. Dennis funded this without apparent resentment. I say apparent because I don't know what was in his head, and I never asked. What I observed was that he treated Rowena's family obligations as simply part of what his life here contained. School fees for a younger sibling 1 month, a contribution to a cousin's medical bill another, a bus ticket for a nephew coming to Dumaguete for a job. He never called these things obligations. He called them just what you do. I filed that away. I didn't think much about it at the time. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement between two adults who understood each other, which it probably was. And Dennis was a good man. Still is. I want to be clear about that, because what comes later is partly his story, too, and I don't want to tell it in a way that makes him the villain of it. He wasn't. He was a decent man in a complicated situation who did the best he could with what he had, the same as most people. He just didn't warn me. And I'm not sure, even now, whether he should have. The baptism was the first thing that properly surprised me. Rowena's niece, her older sister's daughter, a girl of about 20 who lived in a barangay about 20 minutes outside the city, had a baby in October, around 8 months after I arrived. Rowena mentioned it at Sunday lunch one weekend and said there would be a christening the following Saturday. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. Dennis said he was going. I said I'd come along if that was all right, thinking it would be an hour in a church, and then a bit of food afterwards. We were there for 7 hours. I want to describe this properly, because I don't think you can understand what followed without understanding what that day was like. The church part was maybe 40 minutes, in a small parish near Bacong. A Catholic church, white walls, ceiling fans working hard and still losing the battle against the heat. Maybe 80 people packed into pews designed for 60. The priest spoke mostly in Cebuano, which I had about 12 words of at that point. I stood when Dennis stood and sat when he sat, and managed not to do anything obviously wrong. Then we went to the family's house for the reception. And the family's house, it was a modest place, concrete block, a small yard out the front, had somehow been arranged to accommodate the approximately 140 additional people who arrived over the course of the afternoon. Food appeared from everywhere, pancit in enormous pans, lechon that had clearly been an entire pig, rice, lumpia, more rice, San Miguel in cool boxes, a karaoke machine that started up around 2 in the afternoon and continued, without apparent fatigue, until we left at 6. I sat in a plastic chair in the yard, and a succession of people came and talked to me. Curious, friendly, genuinely interested. I was the Kano, I knew the word by then, and I came with Dennis and Rowena, who were known and trusted, and that was enough. A small girl of about 4 attached herself to my leg at one point and stared up at me with tremendous seriousness for about 5 minutes before being collected by a woman who apologized in English and laughed. A very old man sat beside me for half an hour and told me in careful, precise English about working on ships as a young man and visiting Cork in 1974. He remembered specific streets. He asked if I knew them. I said yes, though I didn't particularly. The generosity was real. That's what I kept coming back to. It wasn't performance. A family of modest means had spent what was probably a significant amount of money to feed 140 people for an afternoon. Because that's what you did for a christening. And everyone contributed what they could, and the whole thing cohered into something warm and slightly overwhelming and absolutely genuine. I think about that day a lot, actually. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. It was a lovely day, in its way. I think about it because it was the day I started to understand something about this place that I hadn't understood from the Facebook group or the YouTube channels or any of the warnings I'd read. Family here isn't a feeling. It's a structure. Load-bearing. You'd understand it if you'd worked underground. Some things hold weight, and some things don't. And you learn very quickly which is which. In the Philippines, family holds weight in a way I'd never seen before. Not just close family, extended family, third cousins, the children of the friends of the siblings. The web of connection goes outward much further than any Western equivalent I know of, and it carries with it a corresponding web of obligation that is just as real, just as structural, just as weight-bearing as the love. Utang na loob is the phrase. I'd seen it on the warning videos. Debt of gratitude. It sounded like manipulation when I'd read it, framed that way. Sitting in that yard in baking, watching Rowena move through the crowd, hugging this one, pressing money into that one's hand quietly, making sure an elderly aunt had a chair and a plate. It didn't look like manipulation. It looked like the fabric of something real. Over the months that followed, I attended a barangay fiesta in a town I couldn't find on a map. A birthday party for a woman I'd never met, which had perhaps 200 attendees and lasted from noon until midnight, and had 3 separate cake-cutting ceremonies that I never fully understood. A graduation lunch for Rowena's youngest brother at a restaurant near the Gaisano Mall, where everyone dressed as though it was a wedding, and the young man himself, 22 years old with a new diploma and a shy smile, was treated with a reverence I found touching. At each of these events, I was welcomed. Genuinely, not performatively. I was offered food first. I was introduced to everyone as Dennis's friend from Ireland, which generated curiosity and occasionally the information that someone had a cousin in Dublin, which I always said was wonderful. I was the Kano, and yes, there were assumptions in that word, that I had money, that I was generous in spirit, that I was, in some vague sense, a resource as well as a person. But in those early months, the assumptions felt benign. I was a curiosity worth including. That was something. Meanwhile, I was learning, through observation rather than instruction, how Dennis and Rowena's financial life actually worked. It wasn't hidden from me. Dennis was not embarrassed about it. Particularly, he talked about it the way you'd talk about the cost of keeping up a house. Rowena's younger sister was at college in Cebu. Dennis covered her fees each semester, about $65,000 a term, a bit over €1,000. A cousin had needed stitches at the hospital in Dumaguete after a motorbike incident. Not serious, but the bill was $18,000, roughly $290, and the family didn't have it that week. A nephew had come to Dumaguete from the province looking for work. Dennis had covered his first month's room rental, $8,000, while the lad got sorted. Dennis never called these things obligations. He called them, variously, just the way it is, or just what you do, or just the practical thing. He'd been here 6 years. He'd learned, or arrived at, a version of acceptance around the financial dimension of being a foreign man connected to a Filipino family. I don't know if it cost him something emotionally. We never talked about it at that level of honesty. But he didn't seem bitter about it. He seemed, as far as I could tell, like a man who had reached a working arrangement with the reality of his life here. The moment I think of as the first one, though I didn't think of it that way at the time, was a Friday evening in late spring, about 14 months after I'd arrived. Dennis and I were at the usual bar, a bottle of San Miguel each, talking about nothing in particular. There was a football match on the screen that neither of us was watching closely. Dennis said, without quite looking at me, "Rowena's mother needs her gallbladder out. Operation at a private hospital in Cebu. They're saying P280,000. He said it to the middle distance. The way you say something you've been carrying for a while and have decided to put down. I did the conversion in my head. About 4,600 euro. A significant sum. Not ruinous for me, but significant. I said, "Is that causing a problem?" He said, "I've got a bit committed this month. Other stuff. It's just the timing." I said, "Sure, it's sitting doing nothing in the credit union. I'll lend it to you." He looked at me then. Grateful, yes, but also something else. A look I'd see again and not properly identify until much later. Something like recognition, as if I'd confirmed something he'd suspected about me. He paid it back over about 8 months. 50,000 pesos here, 30,000 there. I didn't keep a close track because keeping close track would have felt mean-spirited. And in the mines, you didn't count favors to the decimal. The money mostly came back. Mostly. Dennis paid back the P280,000, over about 8 months. Not in one go. It came in pieces. 50,000 here, 30,000 there, sometimes less. He'd mention it when he handed over cash. Always in person, always without making a ceremony of it. I appreciated that. I didn't keep a running total because keeping a running total would have changed what the thing was. In the mines, if a man covered your shift because your kid was sick, you didn't invoice him. You just remembered, and you were there when he needed it. I think about that reasoning now, and I recognize it. It's not wrong exactly. It's just, it was the reasoning of a world where the debts stayed roughly equal. This wasn't that world, and I didn't notice the difference. The first request that came to me directly, not through Dennis, not through a hint, but as a straightforward approach, was from a young man named RJ. He was Rowena's nephew, the son of her younger brother, 19 years old and studying at Silliman University. I'd met him at the graduation lunch for Rowena's youngest brother, and again at a birthday party a few months later. A quiet lad. Good English, better than most. He wanted to be a marine engineer, he'd told me once, and he'd said it with the specific, considered certainty of someone who'd thought it through, rather than just landing on it. Rowena mentioned one Sunday that RJ was short for his next semester's fees. Not dramatically. She said it the way she said most things, as information rather than request. The fees were P45,000, about 740 euro. I said I'd cover it. Rowena looked at me for a moment. She said, "Are you sure, Po?" Just like that. "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. I said it was sitting doing nothing, which was becoming a phrase I used. It was true, in the sense that the money was in a credit union account in Ireland accumulating interest at a rate I couldn't have told you off the top of my head. But true things can still be the wrong thing to say. RJ sent me a message on Messenger that evening. He wrote, and I remember this precisely because I read it several times. He wrote, "Thank you so much, Kuya Brendan. I will work hard and not waste this. God bless you always." He called me Kuya, which means older brother. I found it embarrassing in a way I couldn't fully explain. And also, and I'm being honest here, I found it something else. Something I hadn't felt in a while. The roof was next, a few months after that. Rowena's aunt, her mother's sister, a woman I'd met once at the baptism, had a house in a barangay near Valencia. maybe 40 minutes south on a habal-habal. The roof was leaking. The family had managed to put together $60,000 toward the repair, but needed another $35,000 to finish the job before the rains got serious. About €570. Nobody asked me directly. What happened was that Rowena mentioned the situation to Dennis, and Dennis mentioned it to me, and I said, "Tell them I'll contribute the balance." I never saw the house. I want to be clear about that. It's not that I doubted the roof existed, or that I think it didn't, but I never visited, never inspected anything, never had any way of verifying what the money went toward. A week after the transfer went through via GCash, a bag of dried mangoes appeared at Dennis and Rowena's apartment with my name on it. Pasalubong, a gift in return for travel, or in this case, for assistance. I ate them over a few days and didn't think much about it. Then there was Rodel. Rodel was a young man of about 24 who I knew by sight from the wider social orbit around Dennis and Rowena. A cousin's neighbor, or a neighbor's cousin, something like that. Connections I'd long stopped trying to trace precisely. He'd been offered a delivery job in Dumaguete, but needed a motorbike to do it. Not a new one. A second-hand Honda that a man in the Tabao area was selling for P28,000. Dennis mentioned this to me. He said, "Rodel's a good lad, but that's a bit steep." I said I'd go and look at the bike. That part, the going to look at the bike, felt like something I was good at. In the mines, you learned to assess equipment quickly, wear patterns, whether something had been maintained properly or just cleaned up for sale. I went to the Tabao area on a tricycle on a Thursday morning, met the seller, looked at the bike for about 20 minutes, and told him P22,000 or I was leaving. He took 23,000 after some back and forth, and I thought that was fair enough. I paid $23,000, about €375. Rodel shook my hand with both of his and couldn't look at me directly, which I understood as embarrassment rather than deceit. I thought about that for a moment, and then went home and had a coffee on the balcony. And then there were smaller things. A medical consultation for someone's mother at a clinic near the public market, P12,000, a bit under €200. Medicines from Mercury Drug that came to P8,000. A bus ticket to Cebu City for a young woman who'd got a job there and needed first month's rent and a deposit, $5,000 for the ticket, another $8,000 for the accommodation, transferred to Rowena's GCash, and passed along. Each of these transactions was a separate thing. I want you to understand that. There was no single moment where I sat down and made a decision to become the man who funded Rowena's extended family network. There was no agreement, no explicit expectation. Each time there was simply a real person, a real need, a real and modest sum of money that I had, and they didn't. And each time I said yes, not because anyone pressured me, but because it was the obvious thing to do given the facts as I understood them. And each time, this is the part one have had to think about most carefully, because it gets at something true and uncomfortable. Each time I said yes, I felt useful. I felt like a man who could fix a problem. I felt, briefly and specifically, like someone whose presence in the world made a practical difference to another person. I hadn't felt that since Mariad died. I hadn't felt it when my son called from Melbourne or my daughter called from Cork. I hadn't felt it at the Tuesday coffees or the Friday evenings or walking the boulevard. I felt it when RJ sent that message calling me Kuya, when Rodel shook my hand, when the dried mangoes arrived. I'm not looking for sympathy about that. I'm just telling you what was true, because I think it's the most important thing in this story, and it's the thing I was least aware of while it was happening. I was keeping myself warm on other people's gratitude. I didn't know that's what I was doing. Or maybe I half knew and didn't examine it, which is probably worse. There was no mastermind. I want to say that clearly before we go any further. Rowena is a decent woman who loves Dennis and manages her family's needs as best she can. Dennis is a good man who helped a friend without perhaps thinking through what he was modeling. RJ is studying marine engineering at Silliman, and from all I hear, he's doing well. Rodell presumably still has the motorbike. None of these people conspired to take my money. The money simply went where the water always goes, which is downhill, and I was uphill, and nobody had to do anything in particular for the flow to happen. I didn't know the total. That was the thing. I had not once, in those 28 months, added it all up. Alfie called on a Tuesday evening in November. I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd been at the coffee group that morning and had walked home the long way along the boulevard, and I was sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea when the phone rang. She asked how I was getting on. I said grand. She asked about the weather and the apartment, and whether I'd been eating properly, which is a question she'd been asking since she was about 12 years old, and I'd never worked out whether it was genuine concern or a reflex. I said I was eating fine. Then there was a small pause, and she said, "And how are things financially, Dad? Are you managing all right?" She said it carefully, not accusatory, the way you ask something when you've been thinking about how to ask it. I said I was perfectly fine, and I'd talk to her Sunday, and I rang off. And then I sat on the balcony for a while looking at the strip of sea between the buildings, and I thought, am I? Perfectly fine? I hadn't looked at my accounts properly since I'd arrived. That's the honest truth of it. Mariad had always done the accounts. She had a system, a folder, bank statements in plastic wallets organized by month, a small notebook where she tracked outgoings in her neat, careful handwriting. After she died, I'd asked the woman at the credit union to walk me through the online banking, and she had, and I'd nodded. And then I'd gone home and not looked at it again for 2 years. I knew the pension and top-up came in each month. I knew roughly what I spent on rent and food. The rest I'd not ignored exactly, just not examined. I opened the banking app on my phone that evening. The balance number came up, and I looked at it for a long time. It was lower than I'd expected, considerably lower. But the phone screen was small, and the numbers were small, and I wasn't certain I was reading it right. And I'm not a man who makes decisions based on uncertain information. Underground, you verified. You didn't guess. There was an internet cafe near the public market, about 10 minutes' walk from my apartment. A small place that smelled of cooling fans and instant noodles, mostly used by students printing assignments. I went in the following morning when it opened and asked the young woman at the desk if I could print documents from my phone. She showed me how, very patiently, twice. I printed 28 months of bank statements. It was a large stack of paper. I paid $80 for the printing and took them back to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with a biro and went through them the way I used to go through equipment maintenance logs in the colliery office. Methodically, category by category. Rent, consistent, $18,000 a month. Food and day-to-day, modest, averaging maybe $8,000 a month for everything. Transport, occasional travel. I'd taken a ferry to Bohol once to see the Chocolate Hills, a weekend in Cebu City. Medical, very little. Visa extension fees to the Bureau of Immigration in Cebu every few months, since I was still on tourist extensions. Another thing I'd been meaning to properly sort out and hadn't. And then the other column. I went through it 3 times. I added it up on the back of one of the printed pages, writing each figure down and totaling it at the bottom. Then I added it again on my phone calculator. Then once more on the page. The number was the same each time. In 28 months I had transferred, in total, approximately 2,870,000 outside of my regular living costs. That's around 47,000 euro. The dentist loan accounted for roughly 250,000 of that, partially returned in amounts I could see coming back in. So net cost of the dentist situation, about 80,000 on unrecovered, around 1,300 euro. The rest was RJ's fees, the roof, the motorbike, the medicines, the consultations, the bus tickets, the deposit, and a long tail of smaller transactions, some of which I could remember, and some of which I genuinely could not. 47,000 euro, not stolen, transferred. By me, to GCash accounts, to Dennis directly, to a second-hand motorcycle dealer in Tabao. I sat with that for a week. I didn't tell anyone. I walked the boulevard each evening as usual, and watched the light change on the water, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. The Tuesday coffee came and went. I drank my 2 sweet coffee, and answered questions in the normal way, and went home. What I felt. And I've had to think about this carefully, because the feeling wasn't what I expected. Was not anger. There was no obvious target for anger. Rowena hadn't asked me for anything directly. Dennis had repaid most of what he'd borrowed. RJ had sent me grateful messages every semester since the fees. Nobody had deceived me. Nobody had manufactured a crisis. The crises were real. The gratitude was real. The need was real, and had been real every single time. What I felt was embarrassed, specifically and acutely embarrassed, the way you feel when you've miscalculated something technical, and you can see exactly where you went wrong, and you know you should have caught it earlier. I'd spent 30 years reading weight-bearing rock. I could tell when something was going to give before it gave. And I hadn't read this. A man who prided himself on not being naive, who'd sat at those Tuesday coffees and quietly assessed the burned ones and the stopped ones, and thought himself sensibly positioned between them. That man had given away 47,000 euro to genuine human need, without a budget, without a limit, and without once asking himself why it felt so good to do it. That last part was the worst of it. Not the money, the reason. I went to Dennis on the following Friday. We had our usual beer at the usual place. I told him I'd been through my accounts. I said the number was bigger than I'd thought. I didn't tell him the exact figure. I didn't show him the printed statements, which were still on my kitchen table. He looked at his bottle for a moment. Then he said, quietly, with a flat West Midlands calm that I'd come to recognize as his version of care, "Aye, it has a way of adding up." That was all. No elaboration, no apology, no lecture. Just that. An acknowledgement, delivered without theater, from a man who had clearly arrived at his own version of this conversation at some earlier point and was recognizing it now in someone else. It was the right thing to say. It was also, I thought on the walk home that evening with the warm night air and the karaoke starting somewhere 2 streets over. Not nearly enough. So, the accounting. I have approximately $110,000 left in the credit union. The pension and miner's top-up come in each month without fail. My costs here in Dumaguete run to about 600, maybe 650 euro a month for everything. Rent, food, transport, the occasional San Miguel, my visa extensions, the small things, which means I'm living within my income without touching the capital at all. I'm not going home. I want to be clear about that. I'm not ruined, and I'm not going home. But the 47,000 is gone. And I'm 52 years old. And that's not nothing. After the conversation with Dennis, I made some changes. Quiet ones, nothing dramatic. I stopped attending Rowena's family events as regularly as I had been. Not every baptism, not every fiesta. I still went occasionally, when it was something significant, and when not going would have been a specific rudeness. But I stopped being the man who showed up for everything, which had been, without my consciously deciding it, what I'd become. Rowena didn't comment on it. She's a perceptive woman, and I think she understood, in the way that people here often understand things without them being said directly. There was no confrontation, no awkwardness, or no more than could be absorbed into the normal friction of life. I learned a word, nahihiya. It means embarrassed, or ashamed, or not wanting to impose, the Filipino sense of social discomfort that stops people from making demands directly. I started using it as a deflection when an approach came that I didn't want to meet. I'd shake my head slightly and say, nahihiya ako, and people would understand that I was uncomfortable, and the conversation would move on. It worked better than saying no, which here carries a directness that causes more difficulty than it resolves. I still help people. I want to say that. Occasionally, deliberately, when the need is serious, and the person is someone I know well and trust. RJ is in his 3rd year at Silliman, and doing well. I contributed to his 2nd semester after the bank statement conversation, and his 3rd. I thought about it before each one, and decided it was the right thing. He's going to be a marine engineer. That's a real outcome. I can see it. But I have a number in my head now. An amount passed, which I won't go in any given period, regardless of what's asked or how real the need is. I didn't have that before. I had good intentions and a vague sense that I had enough and that enough should be shared. That's not a plan. That's a temperament, and temperaments don't hold up against infinite need. Here's the thing I've been thinking about, and I'll try to say it plainly because I think it's the most important part of this. One watched all those YouTube channels before I came here. I read all the Facebook posts. I was warned about bar girls and fake profiles and construction projects on land you don't own, and women with 3 foreign boyfriends sending money every month. I took those warnings seriously. I was a careful man. I never got romantically involved, never put money in anyone's name, never sent Gcash to a woman I'd met online. And I still lost 47,000 euro. Because nobody warned me about this particular thing. Nobody said, you can be a quiet man, a sensible man, a man with his eyes open and his expectations managed, and still lose a significant amount of money to genuine human need, in small increments, across 2.5 years, because you are a wealthy foreigner in a poor country, and you found that giving felt better than it should have, and you never once examined why. The Philippines will not take anything from you by force. That's not how it works, or not usually, not in the way people imagine when they watch warning videos. What it will do is simply accept whatever you offer. The need here is real, and it is large, and it is constant. And if you arrive carrying something, money, capability, a desire to be useful, it will find you. Not maliciously, just inevitably. Water finding its level. And if you're also carrying grief, and you find that being needed fills something that grief emptied, well, then you have a problem that no YouTube channel is going to prepare you for, because it's not really a Philippines problem. It's a you problem. And the Philippines just happens to be where it expressed itself. I think about my Riyadh sometimes, when I'm on the boulevard in the evenings. Not as much as I used to, but sometimes. I think about her teacup still on the shelf when I sold the house, and about how I couldn't sleep in that house for 2 years, and about how I pressed a button on a flight booking website one February night because I had nowhere else to be. And I think the giving wasn't rational. It was grief wearing the clothes of generosity. And it took me 28 months and a stack of printed bank statements to see that clearly. I'm still here. I walk the boulevard most evenings. I go to the Tuesday coffee, and I talk more now than I used to, which probably surprises Dennis, though he wouldn't say so. I have a beer with him on Fridays. He's a good man. I don't hold any of it against him. Dumaguete is a decent place to be. It's not perfect, and it's not what the Facebook group made it sound like, and it doesn't fix anything that was broken before you arrived. But it's decent. The light on the Tannen Strait in the evening is still what it was. The Carinderia around the corner still does a good sinigang. The karaoke still starts somewhere nearby around 9 o'clock, and I've mostly stopped noticing it, which I understand is what happens eventually. I'm 52. I have €110,000 and a pension and a life of a kind in a city, at the edge of a sea I'd never seen before 3 years ago. I don't know what comes next. I'm not sure I need to. That's where I am. And that's Brendan's story. Thank you for sharing it with us here on Inside the Philippines. What strikes me about this one isn't the money, though €47,000 is real, and it matters. What strikes me is the mechanism. There's no villain here, no scam, no fake profile, no construction project on land that was never his. Just a man who arrived carrying more loss than he understood, in a country with more need than he'd budgeted for, and the two things found each other quietly and without drama over the course of 2.5 years. If you're planning to come to the Philippines, and many of you watching this are, or already have, the warnings you'll find everywhere are mostly about romance, about women, about the obvious pitfalls. Those warnings are real and worth heeding. But Brendan's story points at something the warning genre doesn't cover very well. The risk that isn't deception. The risk that is simply being a person with resources in a place of genuine need, without a budget, without a limit, and without asking yourself honestly what the giving is doing for you as much as for the people you're giving to. Know what you have. Know what you're willing to give. And know yourself well enough to understand why generosity sometimes feels less like virtue and more like medicine. We'll see you next time on Inside the Philippines. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment below. And if you know someone who's thinking about making this move, share it with them. It might be the most useful thing they watch before they book the ticket.